The burned Jeep sat in front of Owen Mercer's house like a scar nobody in the neighborhood wanted to look at. Paint peeling, roof warped from heat, the left door handle nearly melted away. Every morning, Maplewood Heights whispered that the man living there was broken, and unfit to be a father. Jackson Hale, chairman of the Homeowners Association, had sent 3 violation notices already. But Owen never moved the Jeep, never explained it, never apologized for it. He knew something no one else on that street knew. That burned Jeep had once walked 6 people back from death. Stay until the very end. The moment a 4-star general stepped out of that black car will give you chills. Maplewood Heights sat 12 miles west of Washington, D.C., tucked behind 2 rows of old oak trees that lined the main entrance like something out of a real estate brochure. The lawns were uniform and manicured. The mailboxes matched. The Homeowners Association met on the 3rd Tuesday of every month, kept formal minutes in a shared binder, and resolved most disagreements before they became disagreements. It was the kind of neighborhood where everything had a designated place and stayed there. Until Owen Mercer moved into number 14 on a Thursday in late October, paid cash at closing, and parked a burned Jeep on his driveway without a word of explanation to anyone. Owen was 38 years old, built like someone who had carried heavy things across difficult terrain for a long time and had not stopped carrying them simply because the terrain had changed. His jaw was set in the way that stone sets, not from tension but from composition. He kept the garage light burning most evenings, and the sound of ratchets and air compressors drifted out through the cul-de-sac in the hours after dinner, irregular and purposeful, the sound of someone working rather than passing time. His daughter Lily was 9 and rode the school bus each morning without making much noise. Owen walked her to the end of the driveway and waited until the bus turned the corner, then went back inside. He wasn't unfriendly toward his neighbors. He simply had not yet encountered a reason to perform friendliness for people he didn't know, and he was old enough to understand the difference between the two things. The Jeep Wrangler sat on the right side of the driveway, just outside the garage door. It was a 2007 model, or had been once. What remained was a vehicle that ran from scorched brown along the hood to deep charcoal along the passenger door, where the original black paint had blistered in long vertical strips and been left exactly as it was. The roof had a slight warp near the front passenger corner, the result of prolonged extreme heat that had found its way into the frame and set there permanently. The left door handle was partially fused, still functional, but requiring a deliberate grip and a specific angle to operate. The exterior told a clear story of fire, significant and close, but the interior was clean, seats intact, no damage to the headliner, the steering wheel showing only minor surface scuffing, the instrument panel fully readable. Someone had maintained the inside of that vehicle with the same care and consistency that a person gives to something they are not ready to let deteriorate, even if they are not ready to restore it either. Owen sat in it sometimes. Late in the evenings, when Lily was asleep, he would step out through the garage side door, lower himself into the driver's seat without turning the key, and sit in the dark for 20 or 30 minutes with his hands on his thighs and his eyes past the windshield. He didn't make calls. He didn't play music. He just sat there, quiet inside the quiet, in the way that some people sit in places that mean something they haven't found the language for yet. Jackson Hale was 44 years old and believed, with the sincerity of a man who had never seriously tested the belief, that a well-ordered environment was the visible evidence of a well-ordered life. He drove a dark Range Rover he kept cleaner than most people kept their kitchens, managed a commercial real estate portfolio across 4 counties in Northern Virginia, and had served as HOA chairman for going on 6 years, not out of civic generosity but because the position gave him a measure of control over the immediate context of his investments. He was not a man who raised his voice. He did not need to. He had learned early that process, applied consistently and with patience, was a quieter and more durable form of force than anything the voice could accomplish. When he saw Owen's Jeep for the first time, he felt the particular kind of irritation that comes from encountering something that simply has no place in the space it is occupying. He gave it 2 weeks before he filed the first violation notice. He considered that generosity. Eleanor Voss lived directly across the street from number 14 in a house she had renovated 2 years prior and maintained with more care than she gave most things in her life. She was 41, a civil litigation attorney at a firm in Arlington that handled commercial contract disputes and property cases, and she was regarded by her neighbors as competent and fair, though she kept a professional distance from the social architecture of the neighborhood that prevented her from being genuinely close to most of them. She had signed onto Jackson's HOA petition against the Jeep at the March meeting without giving it serious consideration. Jackson had circulated the paper at the end of the agenda, and she had added her name the way she added her name to things that seemed minor and obvious and unlikely to require more from her than a signature. She was not proud of that, but it had not yet cost her enough for her to examine it closely. The first violation notice arrived in Owen's mailbox on a Wednesday. He read it at the kitchen table with his coffee, folded it in thirds, and placed it in the drawer beside the stove where he kept things that deserved to be kept but did not require immediate action. The notice cited Section 7, Subsection 4 of the Maplewood Heights HOA bylaws, which prohibited the storage of visibly damaged, non-operational, or aesthetically compromised vehicles in open view on residential property. Owen's Jeep passed its last state inspection without issue and was fully operational. But Jackson had worded the complaint around the word aesthetically, which gave the violation enough legal surface to work with, and both men knew it. The second notice came 10 days later and requested Owen's presence at the next HOA meeting to address the matter in person. He arrived on the third Tuesday of March, sat in a folding chair near the back wall of Jackson's living room while 12 neighbors sat across a laminate table, and listened without interruption while Jackson explained that the vehicle in question represented a departure from the community's established visual standards and potentially posed a risk to surrounding property values. Jackson spoke for 11 minutes. He was organized and calm and had clearly rehearsed the broader points without making it obvious that he had rehearsed them. When he finished, he asked Owen if there was anything he wanted to say in response. Owen looked at him for a moment, the kind of look that is not hostile but is not comfortable either, the look of a man taking the full measure of a situation before committing to a response, and then said, "I heard you." He left. The Jeep did not move. Jackson interpreted this as a calculated provocation. He escalated accordingly. He retained the HOA's legal counsel, a thorough and methodical attorney named Gerald Forsyth, who drafted a formal compliance notice on official letterhead. The document was precise. Owen Mercer had 10 days from the date of receipt to relocate or remove the vehicle from open view, or face a civil fine of $500 per day of noncompliance. The HOA reserved the right to arrange third-party towing at the property owner's expense beginning on day 11. Forsyth had written it carefully enough that it would hold up to scrutiny. Jackson read it twice, signed it, and had it delivered by hand. Then he photographed the Jeep from the public sidewalk, flat overcast light, worst angle, burned flank fully visible, and posted the image to the neighborhood message group with a caption asking whether anyone could address the eyesore at number 14 before the towing service became necessary. The responses were quick and largely supportive. Nobody asked about the origin of the vehicle. Nobody asked what story it might be holding. Eleanor read the post that evening at her kitchen table and got as far as the photograph before something stopped her. She had her thumb over the agreement reaction and she pulled it back. She set the phone face down. She sat with that small, unexplained hesitation and tried to find where it had come from. She thought about November, about the morning Margaret Olson's Crown Victoria had refused to start in the rain, and Owen had come out of his garage with a tool roll under his arm, opened the hood, identified a corroded battery terminal, replaced it with a part he happened to have, and waved off the money Mrs. Olson tried to press into his hand without making her feel as though she had lost anything by offering it. Eleanor had watched the entire exchange from her living room window. She had not gone outside to say anything. She had not even raised a hand to wave. She closed the message group without reacting and did not open it again that evening. What Eleanor did not know, what almost no one on Maplewood Heights knew, was that Owen's working life rested on a foundation of skill that most people who worked with machines spent entire careers trying to approximate. He had started dismantling small engines at 11, working beside his grandfather in a garage in rural Tennessee that smelled of diesel and old rubber. In the Army, he had trained as a wheeled vehicle mechanic and worked his way into specialized training on heavy tactical platforms, the kind of vehicles designed to function in conditions that would destroy commercial equipment in an afternoon. He had developed a gift that his instructors noted in his evaluations but struggled to quantify. He could hear a mechanical system the way a diagnostician hears a body, identifying deviation from baseline before it registered on any instrument, understanding the internal logic of a machine's distress and working backward to its source with a speed and accuracy that bordered on unsettling. After his discharge, 3 different organizations with military contract connections reached out with offers. He declined all 3. He opened a one-man shop in his garage and let reputation move ahead of him the way it does when someone is genuinely exceptional and doesn't need to announce it. Clients drove in from Maryland, from the Shenandoah Valley, from as far as eastern West Virginia. Owen charged fair rates, kept his appointments, and never oversold a diagnosis. He had a wooden box in the cabinet above the refrigerator, dark-stained, locked with a small brass hardware lock. Lily had asked about it once, years ago, and he had told her it was where he kept important papers. She had accepted that the way she accepted most of his non-answers, as a boundary that deserved to be respected even if she didn't fully understand it. On the evenings when he sat in the Jeep, he sometimes thought about the box, about what it held and what it would mean to deal with what it held, about how those two things were not the same question and could not be answered together. One night he walked out and ran his palm flat along the burn line on the Jeep's passenger door. The surface was rough and granular, carbonized paint fused into the metal in a texture that nothing short of stripping and refinishing would remove. He stood there for a moment with his hand against it, not feeling for anything in particular, just feeling it. Then he went back inside and turned off the kitchen light. What he carried in that silence, what the burned skin of that Jeep carried without language, had a date and a location, though neither was visible from the outside. The 14th of March 2018, Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. The convoy had been running a logistics route south out of the forward operating base, 4 vehicles in standard patrol configuration, moving through a stretch of road that had been flagged by intelligence as moderate risk, real enough to note, not severe enough to divert. Owen was driving the rear support vehicle, his Jeep, modified with a winch assembly mounted on a reinforced front bumper and a secondary fuel supply strapped to the cargo bed. He was the last vehicle in the line when the lead truck struck the buried device and went sideways in a single explosive instant, flipping onto its passenger side in a cloud of dust and fire that rose before the sound fully arrived. The lead truck had 4 men inside. The fire was already working through the engine compartment and moving toward the chassis. The second vehicle had taken windshield debris and was stationary. The third had blown its front axle on secondary fragments and could not advance. The medic was trying to reach from the third vehicle's position but couldn't close the distance through the heat. Owen sat in the Jeep at the rear of the column for the length of time it takes to draw one breath and understand what the next decision has to be. Then he drove forward. He brought the Jeep to within 12 feet of the burning truck and set the winch cable to the passenger door frame, which had bent enough on impact to serve as an anchor point. He pulled, the door gave. He reached the first man through the opening, got hands on his gear harness, and walked him backward. He went back a second time. The fire had moved down the chassis by then, and the heat was the kind that didn't build gradually. It arrived all at once, a wall that pressed against the face and the hands and the front of the throat, with the specific intention of making a person stop moving forward. Owen kept moving forward. He found the third soldier wedged across the center console, unconscious, and hauled him clear by his vest and belt over a surface of burning debris to where the medic was waiting. He went back a 4th time. On the third approach, something in the Jeep's undercarriage caught from the road surface, which had been absorbing heat for nearly 2 minutes. The fire moved up through the frame and found the driver's side floor panel. Owen got the 4th man out, turned to his Jeep, drove it 20 feet forward into the shallow irrigation ditch running along the roadside, and killed the flames in the water and mud at the bottom of the trench. Then he drove it back to the staging position where it sat with 60% of its exterior destroyed and its engine still running without hesitation. He had a second-degree burn on his right forearm that he became aware of approximately 4 minutes after the last man was clear. The 6 men who had been incapacitated, 4 from the lead truck, 2 from the third vehicle who could not relocate on their own, were evacuated within the hour. All of them lived. The Army initiated commendation proceedings within the week. Owen asked them to wait. His wife Caroline had been diagnosed with a stage 3 condition 6 weeks before the deployment and was midway through treatment. He wanted to come home first. He wanted to be present for what was happening to her before he allowed anything else to require his attention. The Army agreed to defer. He came home. Caroline died the following April. He had a daughter and a house and a set of tools and a burned Jeep that had been written off as salvage and released to him because no one in the chain of command could think of a reason not to let him keep it. The commendation paperwork sat in an administrative folder for years. He had not gone back to complete the process. Not out of shame. Not out of indifference. Because dealing with it required him to hold all of it at once. The fire, the men, Caroline, Lily, all of it in the same room at the same time, and he had not yet been able to do that without it costing him something he couldn't afford to spend. On the morning of the 10th day, Owen was on his front steps with a mug of coffee when Jackson came across the lawn with his phone at chest height and two neighbors flanking him in the casual geometry of people who want an audience without admitting they want one. Jackson was in a quarter-zip pullover and the expression of a man who had convinced himself that civic duty and personal satisfaction were pointing in exactly the same direction. "Today is the last day, Mercer," he said, stopping at the edge of the walkway. "I have a towing service coming at 10 o'clock. If the vehicle is still on the property when they arrive, they will remove it, and the HOA will invoice you for the retrieval cost plus the daily penalty from day one onward." Owen looked at him without raising his mug. Not tense, not performatively calm, just there taking in the information being presented to him. "All right," he said. Jackson waited. He had spent 3 days imagining this conversation, and in all the versions he had run, Owen said something that gave him somewhere to go. Pushed back, raised his voice, threatened legal action of his own, anything that created forward motion. The single flat word landed with no purchase whatsoever. It was like pushing against a wall that didn't push back but also didn't move. "All right," Jackson said. "You heard me," Owen said. Eleanor had come out of her house partway through this exchange. She had her work bag on her shoulder and was clearly in the process of leaving, but she had stopped at the edge of her own front steps and was watching from across the street. "Jackson," she said, "are you sure this is the approach you want to take?" Jackson said, without turning toward her, that the HOA had voted and the process had been followed correctly and the outcome was no longer a matter of preference. "I voted against it," Eleanor said, "at the meeting, you may recall." "One vote," Jackson said. She looked at Owen. He was looking back at her with something that was not gratitude and not expectation, just a quiet, clear acknowledgement that she had said the thing she didn't have to say, and he had noticed. She held that look briefly, and then he was already turning toward his door. He went inside. He closed the door without urgency. Jackson spoke briefly to the neighbors who had followed him out, made a small gesture that communicated resolution, and returned to his property to wait for the towing service. Eleanor stood on her steps for another moment, then got in her car. In the preceding week, Eleanor had done something she had not told anyone about. She had typed Owen's name into a search engine and looked at what came back. Not much, a minimal professional profile with no photograph, no active accounts on any platform, no local news coverage. But she had found in the cache of an archived local paper from 2019 a fragment of a brief article about a public award ceremony that had been canceled at the honoree's request. The fragment contained one readable sentence before the rest became corrupted text. Wheeled vehicle technician Owen Mercer, formerly of the United States Army, declined to attend the scheduled presentation, citing a personal loss. She had copied it into a document and saved it. She did not know what it meant exactly. She knew it meant something. The following morning she had gone to the garage on a pretext, a stuck door hinge, a borrowed screwdriver, and stood in the doorway long enough to take in what was inside. The tool chest was organized with the same precise system across every drawer. The concrete floor was clean enough to put food on. A vehicle chassis sat on the center lift with diagnostic leads running from the control module to a tablet mounted on a magnetic arm. 3 windows open simultaneously, each showing a different data stream. It was the workspace of someone who thought methodically about difficult things and was not interested in performing that quality for anyone who happened to be watching. She borrowed the screwdriver and thanked him and returned it the next morning. She had not learned anything she could put into a sentence, but she had confirmed something she had already begun to understand. She had not said anything to Jackson. She had not said anything to Owen. She had sat with what she knew the way she sat with evidence in a case when she wasn't yet sure of its relevance but was certain it mattered, holding it carefully, waiting for the rest of the picture to arrive. At 9:23 in the morning, while Jackson stood in his kitchen, his phone rang from a Virginia area code he didn't recognize. The caller identified herself as the administrative coordinator for the Eastern Regional Command of the United States Army and confirmed that a visiting delegation would be calling at 14 Maplewood Drive at approximately 10:30 that morning, requesting that the address be accessible and that the driveway be clear for vehicle access. Jackson said yes automatically, asked a follow-up question, and found that the line had already ended. He stood looking at his phone, decided it was a misdirected administrative call, and set it on the counter. At 9:51, two black SUVs with United States government plates turned onto Maplewood Drive from the main road. A third vehicle followed, a military utility van, olive drab, no civilian markings. They moved with the deliberate spaced pace of vehicles that are part of a coordinated movement rather than a coincidence. They came to a stop in front of number 14. 8 men stepped out across the 3 vehicles, every one of them in dress uniform. Ribbons, brass, polished shoes that caught the October light with each step. They formed 2 parallel lines along Owen's front walkway, with the practiced ease of people for whom this kind of formation is simply correct behavior in the presence of something significant. Jackson was watching from his front window by then. He had not admitted to himself that he was watching. He counted the men. He counted the vehicles. He read the plate on the second SUV and felt something that started in his chest and moved slowly downward. Eleanor had turned her car around. She didn't know when she had decided to do it, only that she had, and that she was parked now at the end of the block and walking toward the house on foot. The last man to step out of the second SUV carried himself with the kind of bearing that has nothing to prove and therefore doesn't try to. He was in his early 60s, with a face that had spent a great deal of time outdoors under difficult conditions and had arrived at a settled peace with that fact. His dress uniform bore 4 stars on the shoulder boards. His name was General Samuel Crawford, and he held the position of Commanding General, United States Army Forces Command, Eastern Region, one of 7 4-star generals in active United States Army service. He had driven from the Pentagon. He had not called ahead because he had considered the call from his office sufficient, and because he believed, in the way that people believe things they have carried a long time, that some debts accumulate interest if they are not addressed. Owen opened the front door before the bell rang. He stood in the doorframe in a plain gray work shirt and canvas trousers, and when he saw Crawford coming up the walkway, something in his face shifted. Not a visible expression so much as an internal adjustment, the way a structure settles when a long absent weight is finally applied to it. "Mercer," Crawford said, reaching the top of the steps. "Sir," Owen said. The word came out level and clean, without hesitation, the way something comes out when it has been waiting to be said for a long time, even if the person saying it never knew that. Crawford extended his hand. Owen took it. They shook the way men shake when the context between them is large and the people around them have no access to it. Then Crawford turned around. He stood at the top of Owen's front steps and looked out at Maplewood Drive, where neighbors had begun to appear at doorways and driveways, drawn by the vehicles and the uniforms and the specific quality of stillness that forms around something that demands attention. Margaret Olson stood at the edge of her lawn in a cardigan, her hands folded at her waist. Eleanor had stopped at the end of the front walkway. A man who had been operating a leaf blower 2 houses down had cut the engine and was holding the machine at his side. Jackson Hale stood on his front porch with a coffee mug, very still. Crawford did not use a microphone. He spoke in the measured, unhurried voice of a man accustomed to addressing people in conditions where the environment is not cooperating, and Maplewood Heights on a quiet weekday morning cooperated fully. He said that on the 14th of March, 2018, in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, a 4-vehicle Army convoy from Echo Company encountered an improvised explosive device. The lead vehicle was destroyed on impact and caught fire immediately. 4 soldiers were trapped inside the burning truck. The crews of the 2 flanking vehicles were unable to advance due to secondary blast damage. There was no air support available in the immediate time frame. There was no ground unit in position to assist. At that moment, a staff sergeant named Owen Mercer made a decision that was not in any manual and was not required by any order. He drove his support vehicle directly into the fire zone, set his winch to the buckled passenger doorframe, and began extracting the men inside one by one. He made 4 separate approaches to a vehicle that was structurally collapsing from the heat while the fire moved toward the fuel tank. On the 3rd approach, fire transferred from the road surface to his own vehicle's undercarriage. He extinguished it by driving into a roadside drainage ditch and returned for the 4th extraction. He subsequently assisted 2 additional soldiers from a 3rd vehicle who could not move independently. All 6 men were evacuated. All 6 men survived. Crawford paused. He let that number sit with everyone on that street. "That Jeep," he said, and he pointed at it. Not gesturing, pointing. The way you point at something that has earned the distinction carries those burn marks because Sergeant Mercer drove it into a fire to bring my soldiers out. I was the 4th man he pulled from that vehicle. He stopped for a moment. If he had not acted in the first 90 seconds after that explosion, 4 of us would not have gone home. Very likely all 6. The street was absolutely silent. Not the polite silence of people being socially quiet, but the kind of silence that arrives when something true falls into a space that had been organized around something false, and all the air in the space has to reorganize itself before anyone can breathe normally. Crawford turned back to Owen. He addressed him by his full designation formally, in the way the Army marks the significance of a moment by using the language the moment deserves. He said that Owen had deferred his commendation at the time of the action due to a family emergency, and that the Army had honored that deferral and that the Army was honoring it now. He opened the presentation case that a uniformed aide stepped forward to hold. The Silver Star is the third highest award for valor in combat in the United States Army. The ribbon is blue and red and white, and the medal is what its name describes. Crawford pinned it to Owen's shirt with steady hands, and when he stepped back, the 8 soldiers behind him brought their right hands to their brows simultaneously, in a single motion, and held the salute. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Margaret Olson made a sound, small, involuntary, the sound of someone who has been storing something they didn't know they were storing and can no longer hold it, and pressed both hands over her mouth. Eleanor stood at the edge of the walkway without speaking, watching Owen's face, which held almost completely still except for the muscle along his jaw, which worked once, slowly, and then was still again. Jackson Hale stood on his porch. His coffee mug was tilted at an angle his hand no longer seemed aware of, and a thin stream of coffee had run down his knuckles and along the step below his foot. He had not moved. His face had gone to a place that faces go when everything that has been confidently held there is suddenly unavailable. Crawford and Owen stepped inside for a few minutes. The soldiers waited at the walkway at ease in the practiced patience of people accustomed to waiting in public without requiring anything from the public around them. When the 2 men came back to the door, Crawford said something to Owen at low volume, and Owen nodded once. Crawford came down the steps, spoke briefly to his aide, and the motorcade began to reassemble with the same coordinated quiet with which it had arrived. Owen watched from the top of his steps as the vehicles pulled away, turned the corner at the end of Maplewood Drive, and disappeared. He stood there for a moment after the sound of them had faded. Then he looked at the Jeep. He looked at it in the mid-morning light, the way you look at something when you are seeing it clearly for the first time in a long time, not because it has changed, but because you have. Then he turned and went back inside. Eleanor waited. She waited while the neighbors dispersed by ones and twos, while Mrs. Olson crossed back to her own porch, while the man with the leaf blower started it again somewhere down the block. She waited until the street was as ordinary as a street can be after something that changes its character permanently. Then she crossed and stood at Owen's walkway. He came to the door a minute later, as if he had been expecting her, or more likely, as if he simply understood that someone would come and was not surprised that it was her. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I should have said something a long time ago, before any of this." Owen stood in the doorframe and considered her for a moment with the full attention he gave to things he was genuinely trying to understand. "You came to the garage," he said. "You asked about the Jeep. That counts." "You told me it wasn't the right time," she said. "It wasn't," he said, "no reproach in it, just accuracy." She looked past him, or sideways, because looking directly at him felt like more than the moment required. "Are you going to repaint it?" she said. "No," he said. It came out the way things come out when they have been decided so completely and so long ago that the question barely registers as a question. She nodded. She looked at him once more, and he was already looking toward the garage the way people look toward the next thing that needs doing. "My car has a sound near the gearbox," she said, low and rhythmic. "It started about a week ago." "Bring it around," he said, "tomorrow morning." She nodded again. She walked back across the street. 3 days after the general's visit, a white envelope appeared in Owen's mailbox. Inside was a single page on HOA letterhead signed by Jackson Hale, withdrawing all violation notices and waiving all assessed penalties. The stated reason was a review of the circumstances surrounding the original complaint. Jackson had written it himself. He had not consulted Forsyth. He had sat at his desk for 40 minutes looking at a blank document before he typed the first sentence, and the 40 minutes had been among the more honest he had spent in recent memory. He did not hand-deliver it. He could not have said exactly why he put it in the mailbox instead of walking it across, except that some acknowledgments require distance rather than presence to be made correctly. Owen found it the following afternoon and read it standing at his kitchen counter. He folded it in thirds and put it in the drawer beside the stove with the other notices. All of them together, in the same place. He did not think about them again that day. Margaret Olson left a bundle of dried wildflowers on the Jeep's hood one morning, tied with green ribbon, placed without announcement sometime before 6 in the morning. Owen found them when he went out to start his first job of the day. He stood there for a moment looking at them in the early light, yellow and pale purple against the scorched black metal, and then he went and got his tools. He left the flowers where they were. When they dried completely over the following weeks, he moved them to the shelf inside the garage and did not replace them, because they did not need replacing. They were already what they were. One morning, approximately 10 days after the general's visit, Owen came out to find the Jeep's windshield had been cleaned while he was sleeping. Not the body, not the burned panels, just the glass, wiped with careful strokes that left no streaking. He looked at it for a moment, then went into the garage and started his first appointment of the day. He never found out who had done it and made no effort to learn. Some evenings he still went out and sat in the driver's seat. Not on a schedule, not every night, just on the evenings when the inside of the house felt like the inside of something too small for what he was carrying, and the Jeep was the one place where the scale felt right. He would set his hands on his thighs and look out through the windshield at the streetlight beyond the scorched hood, and he would think about the 6 men. Not the ceremony, not the medal, which was in the wooden box above the refrigerator now where it could be found when Lily was old enough to ask the question she would eventually ask. He thought about the men themselves, where they were, what their evenings looked like, whether any of them ever sat in a vehicle in the dark and let the fact of being alive take up its full amount of space. Eleanor brought her car around on the agreed morning. Owen opened the hood, listened to the engine at idle with his eyes slightly unfocused, the way he always listened, and then asked her to shift through the gears slowly while he held his palm against the gearbox casing. He told her it was a worn synchronizer on the 3rd gear face. He said he could have it done by Thursday. She said that was fine. They did not talk about anything else. When she walked back across the street, the Jeep was in her peripheral vision the whole way, and she looked at it once, briefly, before she went inside, the way you look at something that has changed the shape of a space you thought you knew and made the space more honest than it was before. The burned Jeep stood on that driveway through the autumn and into winter. The neighborhood moved around it the way neighborhoods move around things that have been given context, carefully with a revised kind of attention. Nobody filed a complaint. Nobody posted a photograph. Nobody left a note. What had been an eyesore was the same object it had always been, carrying the same history it had always carried, and the only thing that had changed was that the people on Maplewood Drive now had access to what it actually meant. Owen had not given them that access, the Army had. He himself had said almost nothing. That too was part of who he was. The understanding that a thing done does not require narration in order to have been done, and that the people who know what it cost are under no obligation to explain it to the people who don't. He kept the light on in the garage. He kept his appointments. He walked Lily to the end of the driveway each morning and waited until the bus turned the corner, and then he went back to the work that was waiting for him, which was always waiting, because the world never ran out of things that needed someone to listen to what was wrong with them. The Jeep stayed where it was, its burn marks the same as they had always been, its presence on that driveway neither a statement nor a performance but simply the fact of itself, undeniable, unglamorous, and entirely at peace with both of those things. It had done its work. Owen had done his. The rest of it, the recognition, the ceremony, the general's motorcade, and the 8 men in dress uniform and the silver star in the wooden box, all of that was the world finally catching up to something that had already been true for 6 years, carrying its truth the way the Jeep carried its burn marks, quietly and without apology, in full view of anyone who knew how to look.